Good morning, everyone. So, in most European countries, and now also in North America, the steady rise in number of the so-called nuns and duns, that is, the religiously unaffiliated in today's society, is a topic that has been frequently discussed in the media. Last November, for example, newspapers here in the UK had headlines announcing data from the most recent census showing the continued growth of those declaring no religion in England and Wales, which is now moving to overtake those who identify as Christians in those countries. On the other side of the Atlantic, the New York Times has been running a series over the past few months on the phenomenon also of religious disaffiliation. Back here in England, as the congregations of many Anglican parish churches are dwindling, the performance of sacred music, much of it originally composed for liturgical use in Roman Catholic, Lutheran, or Anglican churches, is flourishing, not only in cathedrals, which constitute a major exception of the trend in declining church attendance, but also in concerts, broadcasts, and recordings by professional and amateur ensembles. Scholars have begun to study this phenomenon, as in this book by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Arnold, a former singer with the 16 who is now an Anglican priest. Based upon his doctoral thesis, it moves back and forth between theological reflection and ethnography, the latter consisting of a series of interviews with performers of sacred music employed in both ecclesiastical and secular contexts, the composers Sir James Macmillan and Robert Saxton, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who's having a conference 5 minutes from here, and the late philosopher Roger Scruton. My purpose today is to offer a brief prologue to the task of undertaking such reflection with regard to the performance of sacred music from Orthodox traditions today in non-liturgical contexts. I will be speaking from my perspective as the founder and musical director of Capella Romana, an organization that since 1991 has been offering concerts, broadcasts, and then starting in the around 1999, recordings of sacred music. It occasionally performs other repertories, and we do host guest ensembles specializing in them, but our main focus has been on the music of the Eastern Orthodox traditions, both historical repertories tied to my interest as a researcher and contemporary compositions reflecting their continuation in the modern world. We are based in one of the most secular regions of the United States, the Pacific Northwest, holding an annual series of concerts in both Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. Since one occasionally hears voices in the Orthodox world questioning the propriety of extra-ecclesiastical performances of liturgical music, I will begin by providing a brief historical survey of such singing. A few words about the birth of modern concert culture within the traditions of Western art music will then lead me back to Orthodox music and selected examples from Capella Romana's work. I will concentrate mainly on the reactions of listeners, most of whom are not Orthodox, leaving largely to the more theoretical issues, such as those in the domain of theological aesthetics. So no Bart talking about Mozart or anything like that today. Before I turn to consider the biblical and patristic precedents for the non-liturgical uses of sacred song, I would like to confront directly some of the potential objections to the practice and the reasons for them. First, we need to confront some widespread contemporary presuppositions about the nature and purposes of music. These include the idea that most music is to be consigned to the category of entertainment. This is especially for English speakers, it's a problem. Viewed largely in commercial terms as a commodity with a value determined by its success in the marketplace. These are relatively recent ideas and differ substantially from those of ancient and traditional societies, where music is often seen as a powerful force in the world, allied to religion and perhaps also of divine origin. Take, for example, the tradition of thought about music associated with the shadowy figure of Pythagoras. The ancient Greeks credited Pythagoras with the discovery of fundamental principles of acoustics and the physics of sound, including that of the harmonic series. So if you say have a pitch, a low pitch, and then you take it, perhaps play it on a string and cut that string in half, you get bum, bum, bum. I'm sorry, we're not how about bum, bum. There we go. Warming up the voice today. So you get the octave above. And then, as you keep decreasing the length of the string according to certain mathematical ratios, you then produce all these other notes of the scale. That's the harmonic series. So, you get a 3-2 ratio, gives the interval a fifth, which vibrates 3 seconds times faster than the fundamental, the original note, and so on. So the physics of sound. Now, Pythagorean thought persisted throughout antiquity and was transmitted through the Middle Ages, both Greek and Latin, as well as the Arab world. That's another story, and underwent a major revival in the Italian Renaissance. Its two streams of musical thought were, one, a scientific tradition concerned with the physics of sound and its relationship to the formation and tuning of musical scales related to mathematics and empirical approaches to science. That especially comes out of the tradition of Aristotle's student Aristoxenus. And a speculative and even mystical tradition that perceived meaning in the mathematical ordering of the universe, from macrocosm to microcosm. This extended older mythological beliefs, such as those expressed in the myth of Orpheus, and the activities of the muses that invested music, which comes from the word muses, so it's just divine origin in the name music, word music, with magical or divine powers. So, having perceived mathematics as fundamental to sound of music, again, these Pythagorean thinkers noticed that the same ratios could be observed elsewhere in nature, especially in the movement of stars and planets in the sky. This led them to perceive a single continuum in the universe. Again, microcosm of the human soul, all the way up to the macrocosm of the spheres, the harmony of the spheres, if you've heard that phrase. And it's because of this that we're all united by these mathematical principles, that music had the power to move human passions and more generally transform who we are because of its properties were fundamental to the ordering of the world. Today, we mostly run into this in a metaphorical way when we talk about being, oh yes, we're very harmonious as a group somehow, or that, we had a disagreement, now we're in tune with each other. But they meant it literally before. And this was expressed, again, through, cosmology, all sorts of things. Very importantly for us, when we move on to the Church Fathers, it was also picked up very rapidly by Plato, who discusses it in a number of his dialogues, some of the most important being these ones. He wrote about the proper use of music in society, politics, and education. And in the Timaeus or Timaeus, he went so far as to describe the role of music in creation and the ordering of the world, a passage much later echoed by J.R.R. Tolkien in the Silmarillion, who also has the world created musically. In the passage I quote here, he explicitly invokes the Pythagorean notion that our souls and music are related in the ordering or disordering of their motions. And harmony, which has motions akin to the revolutions of our souls, Plato wrote, is not regarded by the intelligent votary of the muses as given by them with a view to irrational pleasure, which is deemed to be the purpose of it in our day, but as meant to correct any discord which may have arisen in the courses of the soul. So, and importantly for us, this sort of thinking lies behind the writings of the Church Fathers on what they understood to be the uses and abuses of music in a specifically Christian context, because this was the background philosophy and science of their world. So, before moving on to the Church Fathers, though, I need to also to confront some much more modern ideas, positing very sharp distinctions between sacred and secular forms of music. Such distinctions are not entirely new. There are echoes of it, even in that Plato quote I just had. And we find patristic polemics against certain pagan musical practices. Just hitting a few of the highlights here. The Council in Trullo's famous Canon 75 with its denunciation of theatrical and disordered chanting. The Council of Trent's prohibition of music that was lascivious and impure. And there are others. There's papal bulls and other things going back to the Middle Ages in the West. Yet their modern expressions are more closely allied with the 19th century's liturgical movement and rehabilitation of medieval plain chant and early polyphony, which climaxed in Roman Catholicism with the 1903 motu proprio Tra le sollecitudini by Pope Pius X. Amongst the Orthodox, sharp divisions between sacred and secular music have become to varying degrees conflated with discourses of national exceptionalism and anti-Westernism. Take, for example, this quotation from an article on the future of Russian church music by Alexander Kostalsky, director of the Moscow Synodal Choir of Church Singing just prior to the advent of communism. The future of our creative work for the church can also be merely surmised, but I feel what its real task should be. I'm convinced that it lies in the idealization of authentic church melodies, the transformation of them into something musically elevated, mighty in expressiveness, and near to the Russian heart in its typically national quality. I should like to have music which could be heard nowhere except in church, and which would be as distinct from secular music as the church vestments are from the dress of the laity. So obviously he didn't know much about late antique public dress as well. So be that as it may. In the Greek world, we find the iconographer and writer Fotis Kondoglou, who puts anti-Westernism front and center when distinguishing between sacred and secular music. The Western church, in order to gratify people and flatter their taste, put instruments inside their churches disobeying what was ordained by the fathers. They did this because they had no idea what liturgical music was and what secular music was, just as they did not know the difference between liturgical painting and secular painting. But the Byzantines distinguished the one from the other, and this shows how much more spiritual they were in comparison with the Westerners, and how much more truly they experienced the spirit of Christianity. Byzantine music is, in comparison with the music of the West, exactly as Orthodox iconography is in comparison with the religious painting of the West. Now, if in a different paper than this one, if I were to just focus on these, I might probe further that there's convenient exceptions to this. So Kostalsky was very interested in Russian folk music, and in fact, some of his church writing is uses textures that he's derived from Russian folk polyphony. And if you know the Greek world at all, that you know that the same people who will criticize Western music very heavily will also be saying how wonderful Greek secular folk music is, and pointing to the writings of, say, Alexandros Papadiamandis, and talking about how the overlap between sacred and secular culture is part of a demonstrating a healthy Orthodox culture, and so on and so on. So but that's another paper. So back to the New Testament then. So we have reports of sacred song outside the liturgy already in the New Testament, reported and recommended. So for example, we have a report of Paul and Silas praying and singing to God, prosefchomeni imnun, and the prisoners were then listening to them. So they weren't in church or in the synagogue, they were singing in prison. And then we also have the sort of parallel remarks in Ephesians and Colossians. Do not become drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody, psalondes, in your hearts to the Lord, giving thanks at all times for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ to God the Father. That's the Ephesians passage. The Colossians one is similar. Then when we move on to the writers of the, especially sort of 3rd, 4th centuries, 5th centuries, we find them praising what they call psalmodia, psalmody, which at that point is a sort of generic term which can mean the biblical psalms, but it can also mean other psalm-like texts from the Bible, the ones that we call canticles, and in some cases, newly composed hymns. So they praise psalmodia as a means of collective and individual prayer and praise, so both in the church and outside. They value it for its teaching possibilities for learning Christian doctrine. And also, this is drawing on that tradition of ordering your souls from ancient science and philosophy, the spiritual and physical benefits on human beings of well-ordered music. So, for example, this famous quotation from St. Basil's homily on Psalm 1, "What did the Holy Spirit do when he saw that the human race was not led easily to virtue, and that due to our penchant for pleasure, we gave little heed to an upright life? He mixed the sweetness of melody with doctrine, so that inadvertently we would absorb the benefit of the words through gentleness and ease of hearing, just as clever physicians frequently smear the cup with honey, and when giving the fastidious some rather bitter medicine to drink. Thus he contrived for us these harmonious psalm tunes, so that those who are children in actual age, as well as those who are young in behavior, while appearing only to sing, would in reality be training their souls. For not one of these many indifferent people ever leaves church, easily retaining in memory some maxim of either the apostles or the prophets, but they do sing the texts of the Psalms at home and circulate them in the marketplace." So all of those things wrapped up in a single quotation from St. Basil. And so now if we look at the sources of late antiquity, we find reports of biblical psalmody, especially at meal times. Another quote from St. John Chrysostom, one of his homilies: "For since the devil generally lies in wait at banquets, having as his allies drunkenness and gluttony, along with inordinate laughter and an unbridled spirit, it is necessarily, especially then, both before and after the meal, to construct a defense against him from the Psalms, and to arise from the banquet together with wife and children to sing sacred hymns to God." We also find, of course, many testimonies about private and group devotions among urban and desert ascetics. And also in the cities, we find these processions described, that psalmody is something that you sing in the streets as part of the so-called stational liturgies, where you sort of move from church to church or from place to place in a city, making the entire city a church, as John Boldovan said. So famously in the Anti-Aaron Countermeasures of St. John Chrysostom. But we also find this taking place with newly composed hymns as well, very famously with the hymns of St. Ephrem and the other Syriac poet-composers. St. Ephrem, who had his choirs of women and the daughters of the covenant who would sing these hymns. In Constantinople, we have the Kontakia of St. Romanos the Melodist and others, which originally were not an intrinsic part of the services, but they were between them. The full Kontakia, that is, not just the prologues, but the long hymns. And very interestingly, Paul Magdaleno has recently shown that they continued to be sung in that way as late as the 12th century by confraternities. So if any of you know about the confraternities of, say, Renaissance Italy, the companies that would sing laude, the laudesi, going around singing pious songs in the streets, well, Constantinople had the same thing first. And then, of course, also imperial court ceremony. So we know from the various books of ceremonial, that of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, and even later on as well, that hymns were sung at imperial banquets on great feasts. So the Kontakia of St. Romanos were sung on Christmas Day for the big banquet at the imperial palace. And we're more used to this in this society from the continuation of those sorts of traditions in Western society. So again, I've already mentioned the Italian confraternities, who then, by the time the Counter-Reformation comes along, they invent a new genre specifically to bring across biblical truths through music, which is the oratorio. And then we also had, especially in the Protestant world, domestic metrical psalmody, of course, which gets imported into Russia. Titov did a metrical psalter, Handelian oratorio in this country, and in pre-revolutionary France, the concert spirituel, where you would have these concerts of sacred music during Lent. And by the time the 19th century rolls around, we find that concert halls are being created, purpose-built concert halls, and treated as a kind of secular temple with strong religious overtones. Everybody puts on their best to go out to these grand events in the concert halls. And part of that comes out of the tradition of Romanticism, and especially specifically that of the religion of art, Kunstreligion. For example, Ludwig Tieck, in his Fantasien über die Kunst, said, "For beyond a doubt, music is the ultimate secret of faith. It is mysticism, religion fully revealed." And we find these sort of sentiments in E.T.A. Hoffmann's review of Beethoven Symphony No. 5. It unfolds Beethoven's romanticism, rising in a climax right to the end, more than any of his other works, and it irresistibly sweeps the listener into the wonderful spirit realm of the infinite. So even though Cartesian thought and Kant and other people tried to sort of move music off the stage and get rid of that old Pythagorean legacy, Romanticism brought it back through another door. And as Nicholas Cook has pointed out, that this is visible in both 19th century and modern iconography of performance. For example, on the left there, these watercolor sketch of, in Paris, 1840, people listening to a Beethoven symphony, as if they're all in prayer and contemplation. And here we have Kathleen Ferrier, looking up to the heavens as she's singing Mahler's Lied, Das Lied von der Erde. So, that's very much one part of the Western tradition, Western art music and its composers as purveyors of transcendence, which then became very embarrassing to 20th century people in some places, in some ways. I've already mentioned that in the 19th century, there was also this rebirth and a rebirth of interest in paralleling the patristic ressourcement as well, the revival of patristic writings, a revival of ancient music. In the Protestant world, whoops, we've lost my screen. Oh, there we go. Starting in the Protestant world with Felix Mendelssohn's revival of J.S. Bach's St. Matthew Passion, the Sicilian movement in central Germany, among the Roman Catholics, the revival of Palestrina. And then this happened too, as I've sort of hinted at, in the Russian Orthodox world as well, with people like Alexander Kostalsky. We see here the choir of the Moscow Synodal School with an image from a concert performance of Kostalsky's setting of the medieval Russian version of the Service of the Furnace, the Akuluthia Tiskaminu, a quasi-dramatic rendering of the story of the three youths in the fiery furnace that was originally celebrated in the cathedrals of Constantinople and Thessaloniki on the Sunday before Christmas. So during the last quarter of the 20th century, a wider revival of Byzantine chanting brought with it a Greek analog to the Western early music movement. This arguably began in earnest with the work of Kondoglu's collaborator on musical matters, Simon Karas, who worked equally in the folk and sacred realms, very interestingly. So this is a recording of Hymns of Christmas that includes his own edition of a medieval chant by Cassia. But this really went into high gear. Lycurgos Angelopoulos, who also became involved in the performance of both contemporary compositions and with the Ensemble Gagnum of Marcel Perez, sacred repertories of the medieval Latin West. So here's a recording of works by the 14th century composer Ioannis Koukouzelis, released on a French label by the Greek Byzantine Choir. I should also mention the parallel work of Professor Gregorio Stathis, founder of the Church of Greece's Institute of Byzantine Musicology, which has held symposia. Professors made recordings, editions, catalogs of manuscripts. Professor Stathis was also the founder of this choir, the Maestores of the Psaltic Art, now conducted by his student, Professor Achilleas Chaldeakis, who's actually Dean of Arts of the University of Athens. And one of the results of this was that Byzantine chant became as it was institutionalized as modern Hellenism's great tradition of early art music. I'm sorry, it's very faint here. Maybe the light is unfortunately shining from up top there. But these are the 3 concert programs from the Athens Concert Hall, the Megaro Musikis. This was a kind of path-breaking set of concerts between 1995 and 97. The first being Byzantine composers, the second composers of the 17th century, and the third of composers of the 18th century, right alongside with the orchestral performances and all the other sort of events happening at Athens' main concert hall. And you can see this sort of idea expressed explicitly in the writings, this booklet to this recording of classic church music, Klassiki Ekklesiastiki Musiki. In the notes, the director of the choir, Tropos, Konstantinos Angelidis, remarks, all people teach their own culture. The Germans teach Bach and Beethoven. We don't have those others. We have Kukuzelis and Karikis. We should learn about them, yet in Greece, this awful thing happens. Whatever is Western is thought to be more beautiful. These thoughts of our teacher, Lykuros Angelopoulos, inspired us to create a new series of publications with the general title, Classical Ecclesiastical Music. So if one's studying this phenomenon of concert use of music in Greece or Russia, that there are certainly from the late 19th century to the present, strong, nationalist overtones as well to this. Those don't really go over well in the Pacific Northwest. They're fairly irrelevant. So I turn finally to Capella Romana. Again, on my own experiences of performing Orthodox sacred music, some, but not all of it, written for liturgical use, and performing it mainly in the concert hall. Capella Romana, I founded in 1991 as a group of friends to put on a benefit concert of Orthodox music, ancient and modern. This concert began with medieval Byzantine chant and concluded with Stravinsky, Taverner, and liturgical works by Greek-American composers Taikis and Frank Desby. So it did what it said on the tin, as they say here. Since then, we've continued to sing a lot of contemporary music, including many North American and world premieres. Here, for example, are 2 recordings of modern compositions released by Capella Romana in 2022. On the left, you see Heaven and Earth, which has 2 works on it. One is a new recording of John Taverner's Icon of Light, a setting of mainly of a hymn of St. Simeon the New Theologian. And also Heaven and Earth, which was a work that was commissioned by the Society of St. John of Damascus from 6 composers, setting Father Ephraim Lash's translation of Psalm 103 with the tropes that are used traditionally in Greek use on the vigils of feast, the Anixandaria, and setting it in English, a collaborative setting. So the vigil of Robert Keir, the second of these recordings, is a kind of interesting case because Robert Keir is actually not Orthodox, but now Orthodox music is now become a canonical form in some cases, in the same way that you find many composers writing a mass, like Igor Stravinsky, a Russian Orthodox, wrote a Catholic mass. Arvo Pärt has written 2 of them. But he wrote a setting of the all-night vigil, really more for concert use than for liturgical use, though some of the movements probably could be used liturgically. And I'll just play you a little excerpt of it, see if our sound works. This is the Polyelios. Or restart it, or? In Jerusalem, Alleluia. Meanwhile, I'll just tell you that it's a setting of the exact same movement that Rachmaninoff set in his all-night vigil to be in English, you can hear. You can find it on Apple Music and the usual places, so if to listen to it. But actually, this is one of the pieces that was mentioned in a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. Sacred music has come to life again, speaking of mainly Roman Catholic and Orthodox compositions. I think it was one Protestant case as well, written by Blanton Allspaw, the Grammy-winning producer, actually, who was producer of this this recording as well. But this is something that's being noticed out there. The works of Benedict Sheehan would be an example of that as well, his Vespers and his liturgy written for concert use. Oops, let's go. Next, come on, next, there we go. There we are. All right, so isn't technology wonderful? The other major focus of Capella is music related to my scholarly research on worship in cathedrals and monasteries of the medieval Eastern Roman Empire. Often I'm dealing with melodies or even whole services that have not been sung liturgically for many centuries. As a scholar, I'm interested in how chant shaped and reflected contemporary spiritual experience and theological reflection. Paleographic study is certainly indispensable, but there is much to be gained from actually singing these old chants and experiencing them bodily through time. So again, there we are. So one solution to this is to compose new music for these services that matches the present style of church music. And this is the solution that's been followed in the chapel of the University of Thessaloniki, for example. The Andonios Aligizakis wrote musical settings to match the practical additions of some ancient offices that were created by the professor of liturgy there, Professor Ioannis Foundoulis. And then Professor Grigorios Stathis in Athens then went on and did something similar. And so you have had celebrations of the ancient rite of Hagia Sophia, the service of Panichis, a kind of night service compline, more like a compline service, in the cathedral in Athens with new music composed by him. On only one occasion, as far as I know, has this music been used for an actual service. So in Oxford, the other place, in 2001, we did a reconstruction of Cathedral Rite Vespers with the music from the medieval manuscripts, with Metropolitan Kallistos celebrating, Father Gregory Wolfenden. I think you can see him there too. The Greek Byzantine choir came thanks to a grant from the A.G. Leventis Foundation, and the musical additions were done by Ioannis Arvanitis, who you see there with the beard in the center, and then Father Ephraim Lash and I were also heavily involved in this. So, but concerts and recordings, though, have proven to be a more practical and pastorally less disruptive way of presenting scholarly reconstructions of ancient music of the Orthodox Church. So, for example, this recording of hymns of Kassiani includes medieval compositions of hers, including some that didn't make it into the modern service books, also contextualized with some of the psalmody of the period. This other recording of Good Friday in Jerusalem includes excerpts of the stational Good Friday service as people move from place to place over the holy sites of Jerusalem to celebrate the Passion of our Lord. And this has been very well received, both in concerts and by reviewers. Benedict Sheehan, writing in the Orthodox Arts Journal, remarked, the music here may be medieval, and medieval Byzantine chant does have some markedly different qualities from the Byzantine chant we hear today, but nothing about it sounds in the least anachronistic. So far from throwing the listener into a reverie of days gone by, the music on this disc invites the listener to enter deeply into the drama of Christ's passion and to experience it as a present, immediate reality. This kind of direct communication with the soul is what music is for, I think, liturgical or not. And then Father Jerome Weber, a Roman Catholic priest who's also been a music critic and scholar, writing in Fanfare, a mainstream record journal, wrote, listening on Good Friday to this medieval Byzantine chant from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is profoundly moving, unfolding in a series of stational liturgies, that is, observances that move from one site to another in the Holy City. The vivid events are recaptured to show what modern liturgy tries to reenact. And with Capella Romana, we've pursued this most extensively through the Icons of Sound project based at Stanford University on the aesthetics, acoustics, and worship of the Justinianic Great Church of Hagia Sophia. When we started this project, or when Capella joined it, Hagia Sophia was still a museum, but it was a place where sacred chant could not be performed. So, of course, now it's a mosque, so then you couldn't sing Islamic music either. Now, certainly you can't sing Christian music either then or now. And so my friends and collaborators, Professor Bisera Pancheva and Jonathan Abel of Stanford, started this project to study the acoustics. They got permission, however, to take measurements, acoustic measurements in Hagia Sophia, and then to use modern technology, which is what the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, CARMA, was interested in. They were interested in pushing the envelope of virtual reality to be able to experience Hagia Sophia, its acoustics, in real time with modern singers. So this has led to books, recordings, conferences, and 2 public performances at Stanford University. The first was in 2013, and here's a prokimenon, that is the psalm response that happens before the reading of the apostolic reading, the apostolos or epistle at the Divine Liturgy, edited from a 12th century manuscript. And then the refrain repeats, and there's another verse. So the critic of the San Francisco Classical Voice wrote about this event: to the skeptical or those allergic to computer-simulated environments, this may sound like so much caca or the hallucinations of an aging 60s tripper. But I know no other way to describe an experience that, in Professor Bisera-Pincheva's words, was intended to create the sensation that you were standing in a space that was neither in this world nor in heaven, that you were hovering in between. And then in 2016, we went on and did a full-length concert with excerpts of the offices and divine liturgy for the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, the feast we're going to have this week. We also took some bits of this on the road with Pop-Up Magazine, which is was an outfit that had a kind of like a radio news magazine format, but it was done only live. And so a group of us singers demonstrated this with a journalist who had a story about the whole Stanford project. And it attracted a lot of attention, actually, our participation in this. Like the critic for Playbill wrote, they sing and it's 537 AD. This is what it must have felt like, nearly. Lovely becomes transcendent. Writing about this now cannot capture what happened in that room, the story, the awe. And from the Seattle performance, when the choir chanted with this audio effect, my whole body shivered and the tears started up. During the Capella Romana choir's voices reverberated across every surface and light filtered through the smoke behind the singers. Really, they brought a smoke machine. I looked around and saw many cheeks that were glistening. I wasn't alone. It was everywhere, these tears. So I decided to stop trying to hide it and just listen. When the choir chanted with this audio effect, my whole body shivered and the tears started up. So that music was then released on this recording, Lost Voices of Hagia Sophia. That piece that was done, that story that was done for Pop-Up Magazine also was turned into a national public radio story in the United States. And it ended up being the most listened to feature on NPR for that year. National Public Radio in the United States. So, and the recording itself ended up being over 40 weeks on the traditional classical charts. It made, so it was, and these are the statistics for the year. It was the #2 classical album of the year, and traditional classical album anyway. So it was quite the phenomenon. Now, I don't know if you are like me, but I've heard the story of Prince Vladimir's or Volodymyr's emissaries to Constantinople and how they knew not whether they were in heaven on earth so many times that I sometimes need to stop myself from rolling my eyes, particularly because of the gap between our rhetoric in the Orthodox Church and the reality of our sung worship so often. Given both the theme of this conference and patristic witnesses to the powers and benefits of psalmodia, it is worth considering more seriously and at greater length how and why Orthodox traditions of sacred music are reaching contemporary people who are not only non-Orthodox, but often nuns and duns. Among other things, this would require the Orthodox to engage in a substantive way with modern theological aesthetics. Although we have, as I have shown today, a highly developed musical practice springing from ancient beliefs in the power of music, the Pythagorean legacy has largely been forgotten without much to replace it, other than a hodgepodge of ideas imported, often unwittingly, from late Romanticism and modern nationalisms. Meanwhile, I can only offer my experience based on singing and conducting music representing Orthodox traditions of sacred music in non-liturgical settings. It has shown me that the best of it retains its ethical force and can indeed provide glimpses of the heavenly liturgy in the concert hall as well as in the cathedral. Thank you. Yep. Mute that. Hold on. Got it. So we had technical difficulties that got us started a little late, so I'm not sure how much time we have, but.
Thank you very much, Alex, for a wonderful presentation. Apologies for the technical glitches. We have time for questions now before your first coffee break of the day. There's one from Sister Vasa at the back.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's always such a delight to hear you, even though I was realizing that I have heard this talk before.
Yeah, I expanded it a bit from my own.
No, but it's still new and exciting, when you say it. So, I wanted to just, first of all, thank you just for who you are and how you can infect us with, excitement for something that for many of us sounds like droning on and on. In the, when we're not born into that tradition. But do you ever feel frustrated by some of the church music culture that we do have in some of our churches? At least in my church, we have practically we have the type of focus on church music, a very different kind of church music, which I think many would see as very Western Russian Orthodox music, but that really neglects any kind of education in the actual liturgy, to the point where in my specific church, the Rokor, we don't even have anybody teaching liturgy at our only seminary in Jordanville, as far as I know. I don't, live on that side of the pond now for a very long time. But anyway, and the whole culture of the kliros, as we call it, right, the choir loft, sometimes is quite far removed from what is going on in the actual liturgy. And, this kind of church music living a life of its own, even though you teach us, that, going back to the ancient philosophers and the Pythagoreans and so forth, that this divine order through numbers and through measure and through what is, I think, of divine origin that we forget about, numerology and all this stuff, that does reach people. You are missionizing people, you are, even if they don't realize it, So anyway, but nonetheless, word has in Christianity central meaning, not just the symbol has to be accompanied by words. So do you, as someone that I know and who helped me back in the past, with references when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, you're very knowledgeable in liturgy, its history and its meanings. So you didn't just start and finish with music. So my question is, do you ever feel like there is a lack of interest and education in the word of it, also with church chanters? And
the short answer is yes. In that, and this is one of the problems, I think, lacking a deeper understanding of what music is and how it works, that patristic understanding of what it is that we have, and also its relationship to the liturgy, that we have substituted all sorts of other things. Somebody as well versed in the services and in the musical traditions as Yvonne von Gardner wrote about music as, well, emotional coloring for the words of the liturgy, which is a very kind of weak understanding. But I've also had the benefit of some excellent teachers and excellent experiences in just really life-changing ones in places where the liturgy and the music were integrated, and where care was given at all levels to the liturgical experience. So, I mean, this is, for me, an early one would have been my first visits to Simonos Petras, which was the first monastery to restore full choral offices, because during the period when they were synobitic, where it become idiorhythmic monasteries, that the choral discipline that we read about in the old Tipika, these old books of instructions, rubrics for the monasteries, had disintegrated. There was a modern revival too, and on Athos of a choral tradition, because it had kind of atrophied. And because they were working closely, as those of us in the field of liturgy know, with Professor Ioannis Foundoulis, I mean, he was their main advisor on the revival of psalmody, on their, for example, their communion psalms and so on. They brought back responsorial psalmody at communion, all sorts of things. So that was one place. Father Emilianos was very concerned with that integration. My experience at St. Irene's, Agea Irini in Athens as well, that Angelopoulos, he walked the walk on a daily basis, not just the performance choir, and he's at Nicoradia, but he was there as the director of music at this church, and with the liturgy was done with solemnity and seriousness and so on, which is kind of why Christos Yanaras would come and read the 6 Psalms during the Holy Week services. I mean, it was a place that attracted people who knew that this is where things were done with care, and those models have spread out in various ways. I've seen that in the Greek world through things like my younger daughter just 2 weeks ago was attending the Liturgical Arts Academy in the Diaconia Center in South Carolina, where they spent a week with instruction in iconography and also chant, and those people on the chant track, they put this into practice. So they had daily offices, including a 5-hour vigil, so a short vigil by Greek standards, as part of this, so they could put into practice and see how these things were done, how they were meant to work, all the different genres connected. Because one of the things my historical study has taught, and I see this confirmed in the best practice of received practice, is that particular musical genres and styles and so on are all used in particular ways and times and places that give a texture, a soundscape, as I've described in one article, to the liturgy. And it's not arbitrary. It's very, very deliberate what you use when and how. And I think it's recovering that fuller sense of how all these things work together, because then otherwise you can sort of go into facile sort of condemnations of one style or another, sort of, oh, well, I mean, even somebody as knowledgeable as and spiritual and so on as Saint Nicodemus, the Hagiorite, he's picked up the kind of Enlightenment critique, some ideas about it. So he goes after the use of melismatic, extended florid music, and the use of kratimata, these pieces which have some passages on vocables, as they call in the ethnomusicological world, ana, ne, teri, rem. So yeah, but then the other thing that we have to do in the modern Orthodox, globalized Orthodox world, is also come to terms with music as enculturation, because that ever since the Venetian books were published and then they were imposed in translation in Russia, we don't have the level of diversity where in Constantinople or Thessaloniki you could be hearing, at one place the office of the Akimiti, the sleepless monks. You go down the street to Hagia Sophia and they're doing the Ecclesiastikos office, and you go to Studios up the street and they're doing a version of the Palestinian divine office. We don't have that. We've had this idea of liturgy now as immobile. But the only thing that has changed is the music as it goes from place to place. And then how to reconcile those particular adaptations to particular pastoral circumstances, cultural circumstances, is another thing that needs to be developed. Because what one finds in the sort of Greek and Russian worlds is that it's sort of, well, that's fine for them, but we do what we do. Except now with globalization, now in Russia, you've got a school of Byzantine music in Moscow, you've got the one church in St. Petersburg, Boldasheva's choir, that does a lot of Byzantine chant. So that's changing. But yeah, anyway, there's a lot more thought that needs to go into it. That's why I've ended my paper by saying we need to think about the sort of higher theological level of what actually is happening to people, when they're hearing things, and how do we understand that theologically, but also just even understand what our own tradition is, how the things work together as we've received them within particular historical traditions and across them. So anybody got a European research grant ready?
There are questions.
So a phenomenal presentation. Thank you. The first part is from the ragbag of history. Theodore of Tarsus, who was the successor to Augustine of Canterbury, it has always seemed to me that he was responsible for bringing the Greek singing tradition to England. And there's an a cappella family in Sussex called the Copper family, who've been singing for centuries, and they sing in a style which has that bass line that has a name in music. It's there's a pedal bass or canon or
the Ison or the Bourdon.
yeah, exactly, Bourdon, burden, and they sing with that. And I tried to propose to Benedict Shin that this family had actually been a church family singing in the churches, and then with the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, were thrown out and were still singing in that style. That's Ragbag of History, sorry. But Theodore of Tarsus and the Greek tradition in the English, I don't think has been looked at closely enough. On the revival of Byzantine music, Patriarch Athenagoras, when he came to America, found a Greek tradition where the churches had choirs, had organs, and were doing the Mendelssohn Wedding March. And when he went to Constantinople in 1958, I think, 48, he led a revival of Byzantine music. He established a theological academy in Thessaloniki because the learning centers were lacking. And I suspect that his role in this is something also that's worth being aware of, that there was very specific action by Patriarch Athenagoras in the revival of Byzantine chant.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting figure that he was in Corfu, Kerkyra, before, which has a polyphonic tradition. They were under the Venetians rather than the Ottomans, and so and also composed. They were also under the British for a while, which is why they cricket in Kerkyra and drink ginger beer. But yeah, I mean, though the story I've heard from the sort of patriarchal lore on the cantorials that he tried, Athenagoras tried to impose some more westernizing styles when he first arrived, and that didn't go over well. I mean, the story of things at the Patriarchate is sort of its own world, but we just remarked to your previous sort of the grab bag of history that yes, there are all sorts of connections to be explored across. And it's one of the things that's very interesting is that music did not become an object of polemic between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches prior to the 15th century. As far as I found, the first critiques take, the anti-Westernism takes off in Russia first. And it takes some time for the Greeks to kind of catch up in that respect.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really liked your comment about rolling your eyes when you hear this quote about Vladimir's envoys. And it is true that often in parishes, the reality of church music doesn't meet that ideal. And it's often because the amateur choirs, very amateur choirs, are trying to do music that's really far too difficult for them. And I wonder if you've got any practical advice for people in parishes about that. And the second question is, what do you think about congregational singing? And this is something that comes up a lot in parishes that have a lot of converts, because converts have had often very wonderful experiences of congregational singing. And they have felt that it in their past spiritual experience, it's something that has been a real vehicle of their communion with God. And also that they want to be able to actually express the words of the liturgy themselves and not just feel that they have to interiorize it. So could you respond to those two points?
So the first thing, I don't want to imply any criticism of people doing their best in their parochial situations. And it's the people that I roll my eyes more at dare I say, some of the hierarchy, some other, people who are in well-funded institutions, but until recently, the infrastructure for music has not been put in place. I mean, the thing is that if one looks at how music was provided for in the urban churches of the Eastern Roman Empire, it's the closest thing is what one finds, say, at St. John's College or the cathedrals here. You had lay clerks. You had people who were on staff. We know we have imperial legislation saying, how the emperor gave them their Christmas bonuses and how he would give the choristers their gold coin. So the notion that you get all of this for free without an infrastructure, which again, Russia had an infrastructure and it was destroyed by the Russian Revolution. The Moscow Synodal School was turned into a people's singing academy. So, I mean, I think some of it you have to realize that you need to invest, that this tradition doesn't perpetuate itself without some investment. Then beyond that, then the question about then what does one do in the meantime? Well, yes, there's the problem that people try to music that's too hard for them. One example of some very sensible measures have been those that were undertaken by Benedict Sheehan and some of his collaborators at St. Tichon's, where they had, I mean, because they used to have people coming into St. Tichon's seminary who were from families that were singing, and they came in already knowing all the services, and they could immediately form a 4-part polyphonic choir, no problem. And then what happens now, education has changed in the schools. I mean, these situations have changed. So people come in, and what they did was they created a series of new books that were based on some of the simpler traditions of Russian chant, that fundamentally it could be done by a single voice, but also with instructions on how to elaborate the texture into 2 or 3 or more voices, to sort of a flexible idiom. So I think there are practical steps that can be taken with the people that we have now. And then the question of congregational singing, the short answer is yes, I think there should be some congregational singing. Historically, in the urban traditions, there was congregational singing, but it's not what we necessarily think of after the Reformation, because the Reformation coincides with the invention of the printing press. And so then the solution has been you print up your book of metrical psalms among those the Calvinist traditions for whatever, and then you hand it to everybody, or your hymnal, and that's what you sing from. But the old services were designed to include the participation of people who were illiterate or who couldn't afford to have manuscripts, which were very expensive. So how did that work? That worked through refrains. So where the same piece of music and text is repeated, and we have those, the structures are still there in many of our services. At Matins, Orthros, the way the Magnificat is sung with the refrain, greater in honor than the cherubim, that's the same refrain is repeated each time. That's something, once you hear it a few times, you can repeat it. The tradition of what are only festal antiphons in the Slavic tradition or weekday, but in the Greek are also on Sundays. That's from the old stational liturgy of Constantinople, at the prayers of the Mother of God, Savior, save us, and so on. Refrain, verse, refrain structures. So what one finds actually in many of these old services, and that goes right across the Mediterranean, the old Roman Rite, Milan, and so on, that one finds permutations of call and response, which is how you can get people to participate without having to hand them books. And that doesn't dumb down the liturgy musically either, because then you have the soloists, the trained singers, do the texts that change, where they have to know more, they have to be specifically educated, and the harder music. So it's not all the same style.
Well, let's have one more brief question from Christoph, and I think we have to wrap things up and for the next lecture. Okay.
You have a theological question. So Orthodox theology teaches that we cannot separate, nature from the supernatural. We distinguish between nature and the supernatural, but we cannot separate it. And to be more specific, so what does it mean for music? And the question I have is, have you done any research on folk music in Orthodox countries? And is it possible to detect in like Orthodox or Eastern European folk music something like liturgical sedimentation, in the sense that folk music is strongly influenced by liturgy, liturgical art, liturgical music, but obviously is itself not, liturgical music. And in the sense that folk music can mediate between liturgy and everyday life. I haven't done any research. That's my question.
Yeah, no. So yes. Taking the second point. I mean, yes. I mean, I alluded briefly to that when I was talking about the writings of Alexios Papadiamandis and others, in that there are in Greek and Slavic traditions and the Romanian, the Kalinda tradition, everything else, there is a kind of a spectrum from music of the liturgy to sort of devotional songs attached to feasts, which in some cases they're almost a sense of what they call macaronic, in that they will have literal quotes in some time of hymns in High Greek mixed in with Common Greek, the Myrologia tis Panagias, the laments of the Virgin that are sung as women decorate the epitafios on Good Friday are an example of that. So they've got bits and snatches of liturgical hymns in them. The Russian tradition of the duchovnych stichi is similar. So, and that's something then, again, the people, the Philip Sherards and others of the world who have been trying to point to some kind of recovering a holistic sense of what a culture informed by Christianity would be like, where one could have all those things going all the way even to the Apokriatika, the carnival songs. It was Nikouros Angelopoulos who took me to a performance of some quite risque, after a chant lesson, to the carnival songs that were being performed by his fellow student of Simon Karas, Domna Samiu. Angelopoulos went professionally fully into the chant world. Domna Samiu went into the folk music world. But that people see this as a spectrum. The harder thing is what to do in cultures where things are so mediated now by technology, that people aren't learning things by ear, and that's the harder thing. And with the sheer force of industry as well. And then your other question about the wider theological point, yes, that's true, and I think that's recovering that sense of how and why that works. That music is part of the physical creation, but also it's a means by which we have theophanies as well, just like many other things like physici theoria of nature and so on. But it's a very special one and treated as such by the Church Fathers.
Well, I think we'll probably have to wrap things up. Apologies to the friends online who have made some comments and questions. The good news is that we're having a final discussion at the end of the conference, and a lot of these things could be brought back up. So apologies for that. Time is now short. We have to close. Let's thank Alex for his wonderful presentation.